Good morning and welcome to the first concurrent session of the day, Our Economy, What Would You Do? Our presenter today is Dennis Avola, faculty member at Northeastern University, Framingham State University, and the University of New England. If you have any questions for the presenter during the session, please feel free to enter those into the Q&A section at the bottom of the Zoom room screen, and we will address them at the end of the talk. And on that note, I will hand it over to our presenter.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me turn on my slideshow. Oh. There we go. Okay, our economy, what would you do? Looks like we only have two folks on. We have no one else, it looks like. Anyway, I'll walk you through this presentation. So what is happening in our economy today is somewhat unprecedented, and students can't really internalize or react to these unprecedented economic conditions. So Econ Simulator is a software program that teaches forward thinking about our economy and the associated cause and effects of monetary and fiscal policy changes. You know, we see the news all the time, big government deficits, right? Stock market crashes and rises, property values crashing. So in a survey of college students, we asked them about these economic conditions that they're dealing with. And the comments you get is the US government is making the situation worse with its huge deficits. In the war, but the Ukraine war, way too costly for our economy. And it seems no one's buying American-made products anymore. Everything appears to be made outside of the US. And the news media is telling us that the recession has started, but students just don't believe it. Too many statistics without much meaning for students. So can someone explain our economy in simple, easy to understand terms? That's what our Econ Simulator does. It's a process in which teaches students how monetary and fiscal policy decisions affect the economy's inflation, the value of the currency, GDP, unemployment, money supply. And what we do is we use a flow diagram to show the connections between our key economic variables. Easy to understand, follow the money. And the assignment that we provide students using the Econ Simulator is that the Federal Reserve and the US Treasury Department need your help. They would like you to establish the appropriate monetary and fiscal policies that will increase the country's gross domestic product, help reduce unemployment, manage the inflation rate, and of course, strengthen the US dollar. Now, you're going to have 4 time periods in this simulator to make changes to several key existing monetary and fiscal policies. The Econ Simulator software is a free download at econsimulator.com. And here you see the input window. Over 4 time periods, you have a baseline. And you start off with a federal fund rate of 0.25%, currency in circulation, government spending, individual tax rates, corporate tax rates, and of course, the M1 deposit reserve, the money that the central bank captures from each bank deposit. And so what we do is we look at the impact of monetary and fiscal policy, how it changes spending by businesses, household consumption, and of course, government spending. And the school board, based on the changes that are made from the previous slide, where you change interest rates, taxes, you want to determine the impact to your economy, and those are the macroeconomic indicators, the dollar index, which is your currency rate, your inflation rate, your GDP, unemployment, money supply. So you have a baseline. And by the way, the baseline can be modified and changed as well. But students then have the opportunity to make changes to those monetary and fiscal policies and see the impact it has on each of those 5 macroeconomic metrics. So students begin by first changing monetary policy, which impacts the economy's money supply. So they will adjust the federal fund rate. They will adjust the currency in circulation, meaning will they print more money or leave it unchanged? Will they increase the deposit reserve rate or will they reduce it, allowing banks to hold more of their reserves? Those are the decisions that students will make, and usually we've put the students in groups. And the groups are debating over the cause and effect of making these changes to monetary policy. And they will see the impact of that. What happened to the money supply is a reflection of the growth or the decline in the stock market, the credit markets, the employment markets. So you can see the flow diagram starts to show you as the money supply, which is made up of M1 and M2, how that money is distributed to the credit markets, how much is investing, and of course, the payroll portion that is dictated by employers. Now, interesting, we just had a bank failure, and the bank failure, Silicon Valley Bank, and we've heard other bank signature, and the big fear is how that happened. Well, this simulator will show that the bad decisions made with that money supply by the member banks in the financial markets can create a liability for the bank and less for the credit markets. Government borrowing is also key here. If the students as a group decide the government needs to increase spending, which will increase GDP, of course, creates other issues associated with the economy. I'm going to show you a simulation of this in a moment. But as you can see from these flow diagrams, the money supply is distributed, and then, of course, spending takes place by households, businesses, and of course, the government. So let's take a look at now the actual software that you could use. Let me open that up for you. Okay, here is the software program called Econ Simulator. And basically, this is the program that we've been talking about. So for example, here we have the input window in the top right. This is the only part of the software that students need to make changes. Everything else is automatically filled in. What you're seeing in the screen here is that flow diagram, just like I showed earlier. And this is the baseline. So as we look to the first period, it will change the numbers. But of course, we haven't made any changes yet. So let's do that. So we come up to the federal fund rate. So let's say we're going to increase that federal fund rate, which is our wholesale interest rate established by the central bank. And we know what they've done. They've been increasing that rapidly. So let's go to 0.75%. Okay, so I've increased the federal fund rate from 0.25% to 0.75%. The first thing you want to notice is that the value of your currency just got better. And that makes sense. As your interest rates go up, the value of your currency goes up because the interest rate is kind of like a sticker price for money, how much money is worth. As you know, the exchange rate is a value system compared to other currencies. So if your interest rates go up, so will your dollar index. But we're not done yet. Let's take a look at the next item, which is currency in circulation. So it looks like $1.2 trillion is circulating right now. Guess what? Let's keep that the same. We don't want to print any more money. So I put the same number in. And clearly my inflation is starting to come down a little bit because I'm not pumping more money out there. But let's say government spending, we got this war going on and we're going to increase that to 5% because we need money to fund the war and maybe other government programs. The individual tax rate, well, most students like to reduce that. So let's do it 20% here. And let's do the Donald Trump corporate tax rate break, which brought it down to 21%. And we'll keep the deposit reserve constant at 5%. That's the membership fee. So you can see here the Federal Reserve is taking 5% of the bank's deposits and keeping that as their required reserve rate. All right, so we've done a first period, and let's see what reaction we got. Well, first, let's change the flow diagram to the first period. Well, dollar index did improve slightly, but as you can see, it was higher before we grew the money supply. Look at the money supplies. Originally at 9.5 trillion, now we're up to 10.5. We added $1 trillion of money supply. And consequently, our GDP has grown very nicely from 16 trillion to over 17.5 trillion. And we've lowered unemployment. So at this point, looks positive, except our inflation rate is now climbing to 2.6%. So we're heating up the economy because we're pumping more money in. And how did we do that? Well, we lowered tax rate, which generated more demand, which generated more output. Now, keep in mind that as we go through this, each time period is cumulative. We can't go back and say, oh, we made a mistake. And this happens in the classroom where students will make a change and say, oh, we made a mistake. We're killing the economy. Our inflation has gone wild. And they are stuck now trying to fix an economy with only 1 or 2 time periods left. Now, of course, in the real world, there's more than 4 time periods. Governments and the central bank make changes every 6 weeks. So what usually happens is after we finish 4 time periods, we see how they did against specified goals. That is, we start the program by saying, we want you to strengthen the dollar, but not more than a dollar. Go from 0.79 to up to $1 at the end of the 4th period. Inflation, we want to keep that at 2%, but anything over 3% is a problem. GDP, grow it as much as you can. So you're at 16 trillion by the end of the 4th period. Let's see who can grow GDP the biggest within the class. We compare groups. And then unemployment, of course, the goal at the end of the 4th time period is to reduce that unemployment rate as best you can. And finally, the money supply, we tell them there's a cap. Don't grow it any more than 15%. Because clearly, if there wasn't a cap on money supply, people would blow the economy out with pumping way too much money. While we go through this exercise, we often bring in what's happening today in the real world in terms of money supply. We talk about the massive amounts of Fed injections, that is a central bank pumping money into the economy. And we use COVID in 2021, 20 and 21. I believe we pumped almost $5 trillion just based on COVID. And then since then, we've pumped in another 2 to 3 trillion for infrastructure and for other programs that the government has recently approved. So I would say and tell the students that our money supply has grown exponentially within our economy today. And I would say, take off the cap of that money supply and play where there is no maximum. In other words, the ceiling, debt ceiling that we often talk about in the news, do away with it. Just spend as much as you want. And when we tell students that and they experiment, they say, oh my word, look what happens to inflation. Look what happens to the value of your currency. You're making your currency weaker. Inflation is going sky high. And they start to recognize relatively quickly that monetary and fiscal policies we've undertaken in the past 3 years is leading us into a situation that's going to be difficult to correct in the short term. Going to take a while to adjust inflation down, improve our value of our currency, et cetera. And this is when students start to recognize that government policies sometimes can be more harmful in the long run. So we then continue on to the second time period and we say, okay, what do we want to improve here? Let's keep inflation down. So let's keep our federal fund rate constant. Let's not print any more money, which will generate a lot more demand. So we don't want to do that. Let's stop government spending. Oh, I mean, sorry. Keep it at 5. That means we're not changing it from the previous period. Keep taxes there, keep that there, keep that there. So now we did another period, and it looks like we've got our inflation down from 2.6 to 2.31. Our GDP obviously went down because we're not generating any more demand by lowering taxes. And consequently, inflation has gone up very slightly, unemployment, and our money supply is leveled off. So that's a good second quarter step. Now, clearly, we keep mapping our second quarter results to our goals. Remember the goals that we start the whole process off with, the goals of, improving dollar index, the currency valuation upwards to up to $1, but not more than $1. And by the way, one of the things we offer in the classroom is we award the group points for achieving the goals by the end of the 4th time period. So by the end of the 4th time period, we'll say to them, okay, you've earned 3 points because you hit 3 out of the 5 goals. And those points they can apply to midterms and exams. And then we compare groups, group 1 to group 2 to group 3 to see who had a better economy in terms of meeting all the objectives. I've had students spend hours simulating different combinations. Let's go back and change interest rates. Let's go back and increase taxes. And of course, once you lower taxes, we often talk about if you go back to raise them, you're going to get a better performance, but would it be something your elected officials would do? Unlikely. Once you lower taxes, it's very unlikely you're ever going to go back to higher taxes again. No one's going to vote for that. And so we bring in the social impact of economic decision making, where this is a 2-dimensional look or simulator. It asks or raises questions about the real world, how the real world react to it. For example, federal fund rate. It's always suggested you increment them by 0.25%. But what if you said, I'm going to go to 3%? Wow, 3%? Look at my value index. Oh, my currency is worth a lot more. But let's follow, and I'll just cut and paste these here, make it simpler. Copy, paste that right in. So you can see my unemployment's gone down. So that's a good thing. My money supply is starting to climb up. And again, no more than 15% growth from the baseline. So that's around 11 trillion. So we're getting close to it, right, in the third period. Inflation is coming down nicely. GDP, well, went from 16 trillion to 16.4. Not a big gain, but it looks like a steady state. And what we end up saying is, let's go to 4% here. So here, what we're strategizing is just changing taxes, interest rates. And then we end up with over $1 for the currency. Inflation is beautiful, 2.1. Look at GDP, didn't grow very much, 16 trillion to 16.2. Unemployment came down slightly, and our money supply under 11 trillion. So in this case, other than the dollar index, we achieved all the objectives we wanted. And of course, we would tweak that dollar index by saying that rather than 4%, let's go 0.035. Oh, sorry, wrong number. That's not, start over again on that. Copy that over, paste that in there. So in this case, I kept it at 3%, not 4%. And you can see now I'm under $1. So in this case, I would have achieved all 5 goals. Kept my dollar index under $1. My inflation is between 2 and 3% on the low end, which is better, 2.3. Again, my GDP didn't grow very much, but it grew. Went from 16.0 to 16.4. It grew, but not robust. Unemployment went down nicely, and money supply is right at that 15% growth. So this worked. But again, what we're trying to establish here is we're just really focused on the federal fund rate, keeping pretty much the same fiscal and monetary policies going forward on print no more money, keep government spending constant, lowering taxes is consistent. And what we tell students is take baby steps. In other words, don't make such a dramatic change on the first time period, but rather move slowly from the first to the second, teaching them small steps have a better way of adapting to a growing economy. Bigger steps create bigger problems. And then we relate to what's happened in the past year with the federal fund rate going from 0.25% in 1 year time to its current, close to 4 or 5%. And clearly that's a huge jump in just a 12-month period and expected to go higher. And then we tell students, try that in your 4 time periods, grow it real fast and see if you can control your economy. Then we talk about printing money because we're constantly printing more and more money. I've kept it constant in this scenario, but our printing presses are printing 7 by 24. And we tell them, print more money. See what happens to your money supply, then see what happens to the dollar index. So we try to show corollaries. As one goes up, the other one goes down. And that raises the objective. What is it we're trying to accomplish? Is it GDP to grow it? Is it to keep unemployment low and inflation? And we say, what would the Federal Reserve want? They would want to keep unemployment low and inflation low. So play the role of the central bank. And we have another group, we'd say, play the role of the fiscal government. And see the conflicting impact it has on the economy. When a central bank takes its decision-making to keep inflation low and unemployment low, and use the group number two's input on the fiscal policies and see what consequences are created. Because clearly our monetary system is independent of our government, independent of our fiscal policy. You would hope, and I believe it does happen in the back room, there's got to be some dialogue of both groups, the central bank and the government, Treasury Department, coming up with the same set of goals that everyone wins. And then we talk about today. Who's winning, who's losing? Well, clearly, the government fiscal policies have been pumping money out to the tune, unlike any other time in American history. You cannot recall ever that we've spent government spending of the magnitude that we've had in the past 3 years. As I began this presentation with articles from the newspaper, students see that, they hear that. Some of them ignore it because they don't understand it. So in this simulator, we give them the chance to simulate what they're hearing. When Donald Trump was president and he lowered corporate tax rate from an average of 35% to 21%, the impact was significant in terms of corporate profits, but did it really help business spending? And we talk about the articles about where did all that extra corporate profits go from reduced corporate tax rates? And how did that really help? Or did it? The individual tax rate, the payroll tax rate was cut by 5%. That had more of an immediate impact because the individual tax rate impacts, of course, household spending. But if interest rates are climbing, that's going to curb the growth of purchases of homes, cars, etc. So as we went through this model, we can then, of course, show over here, each time period and show the flow of the money. And we spend time talking about the pile of money here, where it's being distributed. And of course, decisions are being made by banks as to whether to loan it out right here or to invest it. And these numbers will change because there's an economic model built into this screen, which you can't see. Obviously, it's in the background. And that model establishes trade-offs based on the interest rates, whether you loan it out or whether you invest it. And we'd ask the students, what do you think if you're a bank? If the bank rates have gone up for loans, do you think your demand will go up with higher interest rates? And they'll say no. Higher interest rates means less demand for loans, which means banks will then start pumping more money into financial investments, right? And particularly, we talk about the Silicon Valley Bank. As interest rates were climbing, that's exactly what they did. They took their money and they tried to make risky investments to capitalize. And it did not pay out, obviously. So bottom line is it teaches students, this is kind of the summary of it all. It teaches students how to react to current economic conditions and news articles and news reports that they learn. And they go and change the monetary and fiscal policies to mimic what they believe will happen and become more knowledgeable. When you first do this exercise with students, a lot of them have no concept of how things change in the economy. And what I often reference and emphasize, it's all about monetary and fiscal, meaning you can't tell households how much to spend, what to buy, right? You can't tell businesses the same thing, and you can't tell governments to stop spending. So the reality is we can't impact our economy unless we understand the changes being made to interest rates, federal fund rate, money printing, and of course the deposit reserve, we kept at 5%. But if we lower that, we would put more money in the money supply. So let me go back to fourth quarter, I'll say 1%. As soon as I put 1% here, that money supply went from 10.8 to 11. Why? Because instead of keeping the deposit reserve here, we moved it into the money supply. That pile of money right here got bigger and bigger. And why would a central bank, that's a monetary policy, why would they lower it? To give banks more options to loan more money out. But unfortunately, the central bank and its member banks have a supervisory relationship, but not a you do what I tell you operation. This is important for students to understand. The central bank is an independent agency of the government, independent. Government can't tell it what to do. And the member banks pay a membership fee, that's that 5% for each deposited, right? But the reality is the central bank can't tell the banks how much to loan out, how much to invest. Now they supervise it like you did with the Silicon Valley, and they realize you're being risky. And one choice the central bank has, if they feel you are you're not using your money supply appropriately, that you're pumping it all into the investment market, they could increase. So instead of 5%, let's go to 10%. Now my money supply comes way down, right? And that says to the member banks, you're going to hold on to less money. So we teach students that kind of throttle effect of when to pump more money into the money supply, when to take money out. And of course, as it relates to, of course, not overinflating the economy's money supply, right? Then we talk about the interest rates and how it impacts international investments in the US, because that's another source of funds coming in to our money supply, right, into our banking system. So the concept behind this model was originally to teach students simply how things change in our economy based on what we hear and read about in the news, and to see if the news media is telling it like it should. Now, keep in mind, most students, most Americans have not gone through an economic course. And therefore, the news media somewhat speaks to them in a way that most people think is factual, but there are a lot of misinformation communicated. And fortunately, this model will tell students, cause and effect. As I often say, if you do this, what's the impact it's going to have on the other macroeconomic issues? And how important is the interest rates to your economy? How important is your money supply to your economy? How important is it to exports and imports, which is also shown here, exports and imports. And again, you can take this one step further and I use it in my intermediate macro course to show the net export effect to changes in taxes and changes to the money supply. And of course, we talk about crowding out. That is the government crowding out all this money, this available, they call the loan funds, how much money can be loaned out. If that number gets smaller and the government keeps on spending, so if in fact interest rates are climbing, there's going to be less money available for loans because banks will say, gee, no one's going to borrow at 8% interest rate. But the government, if they keep on spending money for the wars, this obviously is going to take all of this available loans, these two guys, and that leaves less for businesses and of course households to buy mortgages. And what impacts that going to have to our social economy if businesses can't expand their economy and business and households can't add on or buy new homes? So we talk a lot about the cause and effect, much beyond this model, much beyond just the numbers. But what if, as we would say, what if this happened? What if that happened? This is the kind of a dialogue in the classroom. And frankly, this model creates a significant amount of dialogue in the classroom. Significant in two ways. Within the groups of usually 2 to 3 students. And if you get 2 or 3 students that really get into it, they spend hours simulating different combinations. Okay? So that's the first method of dialogue. In the classroom, you see each group talking with each other, which is a beautiful thing. They get to know each other. And by the way, it breaks the ice too for other types of class exercises. And the second way is after they do this, I ask them to present. The group gets up and presents their screen that you're looking at. And they present it and they explain why and how and what they did. As I observe this and I give them points for their presentation, you can tell it's usually one student that really did it and the others had no clue. And then you get some groups that I require every member of the group to at least talk about some aspect of their discussion. And when they have to do that, we require students to understand what they're doing. And I'll be honest with you, by the end of this exercise, which usually we do this over a 1 or 2 week period, these students are talking like economists. They're talking like they understand cause and effect. And then we obviously ask the follow-on questions. Hey, given what's happening today, what's your outlook as to what do you think next year will look like? And the responses, in my mind, are fantastic. They have a much better insight about where the economy is going than they did when they first started this exercise. In fact, most of them say this program, the Econ Simulator, was a way for them to open up their eyes to what makes things change, what makes consumption, household consumption change, residential, home purchases, what changes in terms of imports and exports. It really opens up their eyes to exactly what makes our economy change. So the name of the economy was appropriate. What would you do? Because it's open. There's no one absolute correct answer. And I make that very clear. You can either crash the economy or you can make it robust, but your changes will be different than every other group's. And invariably they are, which is kind of a nice thing to see, different thinkings within the groups. So that is the presentation for today. I noticed we really had, other than the two folks from the publisher on, I don't see anyone else. So at this point, we could wrap it up unless there's a question.
We actually do have a couple of questions coming in through the Q&A.
Okay.
Is this best used in a principles or intermediate macro course?
It's primarily used in the principles course, but I carry my intermediate course. I carry it on because it's a good way to build on this as to, as I mentioned earlier, what happens if suddenly governments increase their spending from 5% to 20%? What's its impact going to be on net exports and other areas that you don't see on the screen? So mostly principles, but can be used in intermediate.
Okay. We had another question. What marginal propensities are used in the model? Is it possible to change the parameters of the model, such as MPC and MPS? Are you able to change the initial baseline?
That's a great question. No, it's already established in the baseline. No, the MPC here is not a variable to change.
Okay, and then we had one other question come through. Does the relatively recent shifts of funneling investments in a cryptocurrency affected the economy? And if so, how?
Well, that's a great question. Yeah, any investment, any money that, remember, this is the money supply that banks invest, okay? And so, yeah, that is one of the investments that banks make is in cryptocurrency, as do individual investors like you and I. But any investment that's not used for the loanable fund market doesn't help the economy. And I want to point out, if you look at this flow diagram, this financial investments, that's everything, crypto, stocks, bonds. You notice it doesn't go anywhere. The money stops. It doesn't benefit the economy other than, of course, the financial services industry. But it doesn't help your economy in terms of its GDP growth, what have you, as money is put into this financial investment bucket. So crypto, like any other gold, that's the big theme now, is invest in gold. As long as banks continue to do this, it doesn't enable, it's not an enabler of your economy. It's really for the benefit of the bank individually. And that's, again, Silicon Valley, it's exactly what they did. They took some risk for their own purposes, for their own management purposes, and that certainly backfired on them. Now, you would hope that the central bank would be a watchdog and try to regulate. And some of the big banks, they do. They have controls now where they're watching the difference of how much this bucket grows versus this available loans bucket. They're watching that because the central bank needs to make sure that its member banks are effectively keeping the bucket for available loans, growing. The labor force bucket, that's a fixed bucket. That's, the employers are telling its banks to pay its employees. So that's a fixed number that will grow with up and down based on the unemployment rate. But it's the middle bucket that the central bank wants to make sure there's sufficient funds in that middle bucket for loans to keep governments, businesses, and households, as you can see the flow diagram, these three guys having monies to expand and grow.
Can you share the website one more time that you have gotten this software from?
Well, I wrote the software.
You wrote the software.
Yeah, I wrote the software. And so the econsimulator.com was the software site that a website I had set up. This has been used by over 100 universities in the US. So econsimulator.com. But if you have a problem getting there, just email me. And my email address, let me jump back to it. My email address, if you're interested in getting a copy or want to know more about it, here we go. Yeah, there's a workbook that goes with it, the student workbook for this exercise. There's a website, econsimulator.com. No, I'm missing the page I was looking for. Anyway, my email is avola.dennis@gmail. That's the best way to get me. AVOLA Dennis.@gmail. And we can certainly get you a copy of this. Like I say, that's how it works.
I'm going to drop that into the chat so that people do have your information.
Okay.
And avoladennis@gmail.com.
Yeah, that'd be great. It's easy to get me. I check that. It's on my cell phone, so I can't miss it.
And we will be following up with this recording to registrants for anybody that was not able to attend or didn't catch the whole entire presentation.
Okay.
But we want to thank you so much for all the
Thank you.
valuable information that you shared with us today. We really do appreciate it. The next concurrent session will begin at 12:00 p.m. Eastern Time, and you can view the chat for session meeting room links or access the conference website for a complete list of concurrent sessions and their descriptions. While accessing the conference website, don't forget to swing by the virtual exhibit hall to say hello to the Hawks team. And while there, you can view a quick 5-minute demonstration, request your t-shirt, and be entered to win a $50 hourly giveaway. Also, in the spirit of St. Patrick's Day, you'll find a few golden coins throughout the conference website. Click on the coins to be entered to win an additional raffle, and we will see you at the next session.
Thank you. Enjoyed it. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.
I know.